He's like he's 7 feet. In his rookie season, amazing fans around the league with his explosive jumping ability, the Denver Nuggets, David Thompson.
This is the story of how the Denver Nuggets stole the Atlanta Hawks' chance to be one of the best teams in the Eastern Conference in the late 1970s. Here is the story of one of the biggest draft swindles in basketball history. Now, Denver's triumph in Atlanta's misery could not have happened without some meddling from the New Orleans Jazz. The Jazz were eager, and some might say even desperate, to acquire Pete Maravich from the Hawks. Getting Pistol Pete was bound to make the expansion Jazz winners on the court and garner sellout crowds as the team made its inaugural season in 1975. At least, that was the plan. The question is, how desperate were the Jazz? In May of 1974, the Hawks traded Maravich to the Jazz for 2 players and 5 draft picks, including a 1975 first-round pick, which became David Thompson. By the way, another one of those picks that manifested in 1976 became Alex English. Yeah, New Orleans was desperate. And they also stunk. The Jazz started the 1975 NBA season 0-11. By the All-Star break, they were 4-34. They would somehow rally to finish the season 23-59, but that was still easily the worst record in the NBA. For all their on-court troubles, the Jazz got themselves the number 1 pick in the draft. But, as we remember, they traded that 1975 first-round pick to the Hawks in the Maravich trade. By the end of 1979, after all these blunders, the Jazz were packing their bags for Utah. Now, as for Atlanta, they looked pretty bright for having shipped off Maravich for all of those picks. With Maravich in that 1974 season before he was traded, the Hawks were a mediocre 35-47. Without him in 1975, they went 31-51, but did so despite perennial All-Star Lou Hudson missing almost the entire year. The big story for the Hawks in 1975 was rookie forward John Drew, who averaged 19-11. Lou Hudson had just entered his 30s and, despite being on the decline, was still a very effective player, while John Drew was projecting to be an awesome wing scorer and a terror on the offensive glass at 6'6", 205. Now, Atlanta could also add the number 1 overall draft pick courtesy of the Jazz, in addition to their own pick, which was slotted at number 3. With the number 1 pick, Atlanta selected college superstar David Thompson, who had just averaged 30 points and 8 rebounds per game on 55% shooting as a senior at North Carolina State. With the number 3 pick, they snagged promising center Marvin Webster out of Morgan State. Now, Thompson, Webster, Hudson, and Drew, that's not too shabby for a core to build your team around. And with the Celtics aging, the Hawks had a real chance to leap into contention with the likes of other Eastern juggernauts of the late 70s, like Philly and Washington. Meanwhile, in the ABA, the Denver Nuggets were an absolute powerhouse. Under the coaching of Larry Brown, yes, that Larry Brown, who later coached the Pistons to a title in 2004 but is in his mid-30s in the 1970s, and with a talented 7-man rotation including players like Bobby Jones, Mac Calvin, and Ralph Simpson, the Nuggets finished the 1975 ABA season with a 65-19 record. Although they were upset in 7 games in the Western Division Finals by the Pacers, the Nuggets were clearly full of talent and primed to threaten for a title for years. As an aggressive organization, instead of simply running it back, the Nuggets decided to hustle the Hawks. Immediately following the NBA's draft in late May, George Cunningham of the Atlanta Constitution asked the question, can the Hawks afford to sign Thompson and Webster, the 2 first-round picks who are expected to ask for a total of $4 million and eventually wind up getting about $3 million? Nearly a month later, June 17th, the situation still wasn't resolved, and signs were growing worse for the Hawks, doubt now lingering of the franchise being able to even sign their 2 young stars. On the ABA side of things, the Squires of Virginia technically held Thompson's ABA rights, but the Associated Press was sure that he will be traded to Denver if the Nuggets can sign him. Basically, the Virginia Squires were complete accomplices in Denver's robbery of Atlanta. David Thompson's agent, Larry Fleischer, had practically been oiling up the getaway car and revving the engine, giving strong hints that Atlanta was a long-shot choice by mid-June. After having just one meeting with the Hawks since the NBA draft, Fleischer assessed the situation, saying, "I indicated to Atlanta what it would take to sign him, and I am still waiting for a response." Well, the question is, why couldn't Atlanta get the money? A major issue was a $400,000 fine that the NBA slapped on the franchise over the Julius Erving signing violation of 3 years ago. That whole situation being an episode for another time. But as the AP noted, there now is doubt whether the Hawks can bid for both Webster and Thompson. And remember, at that time in league history, the league is struggling. The $400,000 fine was no joke. That was the annual salary of the NBA and ABA superstar players at the time. Think of the Lakers today getting slapped with a $50 million fine. Yeah, might make it a little tough to wiggle around financially. Sure enough, on June 20th, it was reported that Webster had inked a $1.5 million contract with the Nuggets. Webster reportedly didn't like the way that the Hawks handled their negotiations. The entire fiasco was complete by July 9th, when the AP reported that David Thompson had signed a $3 million deal over 6 years with the Nuggets. The $500,000 annual salary made him the richest rookie in the history of pro sports at the time, and Denver didn't stop there. In October of 1975, when the financially distressed Baltimore Claws sent them Dan Issel for basically a bag of potato chips. Denver paid off the Virginia Squires for helping them out by sending them Matt Calvin for Thompson's ABA rights and officially signed the superstar guard in mid-July. Obviously loaded, the Nuggets again tore through the ABA with a league-best 60 wins and this time made the finals. However, they were upset once again as the New York Nets bested them in the ABA finals in 6 ridiculously competitive and hard-fought games. All 6 games of the 1976 ABA finals were decided by single digits, and all the stars showed out. A 21-year-old David Thompson averaged 28 and 6 on 57% shooting, Dan Issel averaged 23 and 13, and Julius Erving at the peak of his powers averaged a monstrous 38, 14 and 5 on 59% shooting. Denver had the better team, but the Nets had Dr. J at his apex. Now, as for Atlanta Hawks president and general manager Bud Suriatin said, "We're extremely disappointed, but life goes on." For the Hawks, losing Webster was definitely a sting. After all, that was their number 3 pick down the drain. While Webster certainly had his moments during his 10-year ABA-NBA career, most notably helping the Sonics to get within 1 game of the 1978 championship, he was never really a star and ultimately was more of a loss in terms of opportunity, as the 2 players selected right behind Webster were centers Alvin Adams and Daryl Dawkins, and Atlanta definitely could have used either center in their lineups. Of course, losing David Thompson was the real tragedy. After having stumbled their way into the number 1 overall pick through the desperation of the New Orleans Jazz, Atlanta lost out on a generational talent for basically nothing. Even considering David Thompson's battles with addiction in the late 70s and early 80s, he was a bona fide superstar, one of the most electrifying and exciting players of the era, and was ultimately inducted into the Hall of Fame. David Thompson was the player that Michael Jordan idolized growing up. Atlanta did recover from the 1975 fiasco by drafting Tree Rollins and Eddie Johnson in 1977, and they also traded for defensive stalwart Dan Roundfield in 1978, and they even saw John Drew grow into a certified bucket. They won 41, 46, and 50 games respectively from 1978 to 1980, but you ask yourself and wonder what Atlanta could have been in a time when the East was relatively wide open before Bird's Celtics took over, as it wouldn't be until 2015 when the Hawks would make their first East Finals in Atlanta. And this is one of the biggest what-ifs in NBA history.